The disappearance of Linda Pagano remains one of the most mysterious cold cases ever to challenge the patience of Ohio investigators. The sudden vanishing of the young girl in 1974 left a painful void for her family that lasted for many decades. This case draws special public attention because of the strange combination of systemic failure and the power of modern digital technology. Unanswered questions about that fateful night continue to haunt the online community throughout more than 40 years of silence and confusion. The story begins in a dark library where Christina Skates was diligently flipping through the pages of old and dusty cemetery records. She stopped before a strange entry containing only 3 short words, but carrying the heavy weight of a terrifying and hidden truth. The lines recorded the existence of white female bones, but absolutely lacked any name or origin to identify the deceased poor girl. Instead of a human identity, the system only recognized this victim by a soulless identification number, which was 82483. Christina felt a cold shiver running down her spine as she realized the cruelty of a human being turned into a mere digit. She knew this record was not just a random mistake, but a testament to a life that had been completely forgotten by society. Her efforts to contact the cemetery only received a terrifying silence because no further investigation had been conducted for a long time. Meanwhile, in another state, a man named Carl Koppelman was also obsessed with faces that had no names in the official records. He was an artist with a special ability to transform dry skulls into vivid portraits full of life and deep human emotion. Carl scrolled through thousands of missing person profiles online every day, hoping to find some fragile connection between the lost and found. He did not know that destiny was leading him and Christina closer to the secret of the girl labeled number 82483. We travel back in time to the night of August 31st, 1974, when a heavy summer storm was approaching the quiet town. Linda Pagano was then a vibrant 17-year-old girl with a bright future and a brand new white Mustang car she loved dearly. She had just returned from an exciting concert, but did not know that a nightmare was waiting for her inside her own home. Her stepfather, Byron Claflin, was a hot-tempered man and was extremely angry because Linda had returned home much later than the curfew. A violent argument broke out between the two, making the atmosphere in the small apartment suffocating and filled with deep-seated hatred. In a blind rage, Byron kicked his wife's daughter out of the house in the middle of a dark and dangerous late night. Linda walked out the door, without taking anything except the clothes on her back and the overwhelming resentment rising in her heart. She left her Mustang keys on the table and vanished into the pitch-black night of Akron City without leaving any physical trace behind. The next morning, when the anger had faded, the family began to realize the unusual absence of the beautiful and young teenage girl. Linda's mother believed her daughter was just hiding somewhere, but as time passed, a chilling fear began to consume her entire mind. They reported to the police, but what they received was only indifference from the law enforcement officers acting at that specific time. The police assumed this was just a case of a teenager running away from home due to family conflict, so they did nothing. There was no press release or any effort made to track Linda's footsteps during the critical first few hours of her disappearance. The negligence of the system unintentionally created the conditions for darkness to swallow the fate of that 17-year-old girl forever. While the Pagano family was desperately waiting for news, an unidentified body had been discovered at a distant local park nearby. Medical examiners performed an autopsy, but a fateful typing error caused this vital record to become completely invisible within the police system. Instead of correctly typing the word unidentified, they misspelled it, causing the data to never appear in any official database search results. 1 year later, Linda's brother Mike tried to contact the police to ask about any unidentified female bodies found in the area. He hoped that some miracle would help him find his sister, but the answer from the police was incredibly dismissive and cold. They claimed the newly found body was not Linda based on height and age parameters that were actually completely inaccurate and wrong. This terrible confusion slammed the door on the truth and forced Linda to continue lying in the darkness of an anonymous grave. Authorities even argued over who would have to pay the $100 burial fee for the poor and unidentified young victim. Eventually, they decided to bury her in a desolate field reserved for the homeless and those without any living relatives to claim them. The young girl, who once had a beautiful name, now only had a number engraved on a cheap and gloomy plastic marker. Her grave without a headstone was slowly covered by weeds and erased from the memory of the cemetery managers over many years. Decades passed, and Linda's mother died in extreme agony because she never knew what had really happened to her beloved daughter. The secret of her disappearance seemed to be buried forever with the death of Byron Claflin in the year 1990. But Linda's spirit seemed to still be waiting for someone with enough persistence to decode those fateful and mysterious digital numbers. Christina Skates stared at her computer screen and wondered if number 82483 was actually a real human being. She began gathering scattered fragments from the past to reconstruct a full picture of betrayal and the cruelty of being forgotten. A journey to find justice through 40 years of official history began with many unexpected and haunting details that shocked the world. The investigation moved from the dusty archives of the local cemetery to the vast and complex world of the digital internet. Christina Skates spent countless nights staring at the blurry scan of the handwritten record labeled 82483. She began to wonder how a human being could simply be reduced to a box of bones in a forgotten potter's field. The more she dug into the local history of Akron, the more she realized that the city held many dark secrets. Meanwhile, Carl Koppelman was using his artistic skills to give a face to a Jane Doe found in 1975. He carefully studied the forensic measurements of the skull to reconstruct the delicate features of a young woman's face. Every stroke of his digital brush was an attempt to restore the dignity that had been stripped away by cold bureaucracy. The reconstruction revealed a girl with a gentle smile and expressive eyes, which looked hauntingly familiar to anyone who knew her. Carl posted the image on a popular website dedicated to missing persons, hoping that someone would recognize the mystery girl. Thousands of miles away, the remnants of the Pagano family were still living in the long shadow of Linda's sudden disappearance. Her brother Mike had never stopped looking for his sister, even though the trail had gone cold decades ago. He often visited the old neighborhood where they grew up, trying to trigger a memory or find a witness who knew. The guilt of that night weighed heavily on him because he felt he should have been there to protect her. He remembered the sound of the slamming door and the cold silence that followed after Linda walked out into the rain. Back in the present day, Christina managed to convince a local official to help her locate the actual physical burial site. They walked through a field of overgrown grass where hundreds of unidentified souls were buried, without any proper memorial markers. Using a rusted map of the cemetery grid, they finally stood over the spot where record 82483 lay. It was a sobering moment to realize that a vibrant life had been reduced to a small patch of dirt and weeds. Christina knew that the only way to prove the identity of the remains was through the power of modern DNA testing. However, the process of exhuming a body was a legal nightmare filled with red tape and a lack of official funding. She reached out to the local police department, but once again she was met with a wall of professional indifference. The detectives argued that the case was too old, and the resources were needed for more recent and pressing criminal investigations. Undeterred, Christina turned to the power of social media to share the story of the girl who had been forgotten. The story quickly gained traction as people from all over the world were outraged by the systemic failures of the past. They couldn't believe that a simple typing error had kept a family in agony for more than 40 long years. A group of volunteer researchers joined the cause, providing their expertise in genealogy to help narrow down the potential matches. They cross-referenced the date the body was found with every missing person report filed in the state of Ohio that year. The list was long, but one name kept surfacing at the top of their search results because of a tragic coincidence. Linda Pagano had gone missing on the same weekend that the unidentified body was discovered just a few miles away. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together, but the most difficult part of the journey lay ahead. They needed a direct DNA sample from a living relative to confirm that the girl in the grave was indeed Linda. Mike Pagano was eventually contacted by the researchers, and he felt a surge of hope he hadn't felt in years. He agreed to provide a swab of his DNA, hoping that it would finally bring his sister back to the family. The sample was sent to a specialized lab where scientists worked to extract genetic material from the decades-old skeletal remains. Every day of waiting was an agonizing reminder of the time that had been lost due to human error and neglect. Inside the lab, the ancient bones held the code that would either unlock the truth or deepen the mystery forever. The tension was palpable as the community of online sleuths waited for the official announcement from the medical examiner's office. They were about to find out if the girl with the Mustang was finally going to get her name back at last. But as the truth began to emerge, new and darker questions about the night of her disappearance started to surface. If the body in the park was Linda, then how exactly did she end up there after leaving her house? The discovery was not just the end of a mystery, but the beginning of a cold-blooded murder investigation decades late. The shadow of Byron Claflin loomed larger than ever as investigators began to re-examine his original statements to the police. Was he merely a grieving stepfather, or was he a monster who had hidden his crimes behind a mask of anger? The investigation was moving into a dangerous new phase, where the secrets of the dead would finally be heard aloud. Every detail from 1974 was being scrutinized under the microscope of 21st century technology and a relentless pursuit. The silence of 40 years was about to be broken by a truth that no one was truly prepared to face. The forensic laboratory in Ohio became the silent battlefield where science fought against the relentless erosion of time. Scientists carefully extracted mitochondrial DNA from the fragile fragments of the femur bone found in the forgotten grave. This genetic material was the only bridge left between the living world and the girl known as number 82483. Meanwhile, Mike Pagano sat in his quiet home, clutching an old Polaroid of Linda smiling in the summer sun. He remembered her laughter and the way she used to dream about traveling far away from their small town. The weight of 40 years of uncertainty felt like a physical burden that was finally beginning to shift slightly. In a different part of the country, Christina Skates continued to document every step of the investigation for the public. She believed that transparency was the only way to ensure that the authorities did not bury the case again. Her online blog became a gathering place for thousands of people who were now emotionally invested in Linda's story. They shared theories about the night of August 31st and analyzed the weather patterns of that stormy weekend. One researcher discovered an old police log that mentioned a suspicious vehicle seen near the park that same night. The vehicle description was vague, but it matched the type of car that Byron Claflin was known to drive. This small detail sent shockwaves through the community of amateur sleuths who were hunting for any sign of foul play. If Byron had truly kicked her out into the storm, why did he not go looking for her later? The original police report stated that he claimed she simply walked away and never looked back at the house. But neighbors later recalled hearing muffled shouting that lasted much longer than a simple argument over a curfew. The shadows of the past were stretching into the present as investigators revisited the site where the bones were found. The park had changed significantly over the decades, but the specific location of the discovery remained chillingly isolated. It was a place where someone could easily hide a crime under the cover of a violent summer thunderstorm. Back at the lab, the DNA sequencing was finally nearing completion after weeks of meticulous and painstaking work. The digital markers began to align with the sample provided by Mike Pagano in a perfect genetic match. On a Tuesday morning, the medical examiner officially signed the document that would change history for the Pagano family. The unidentified remains of record 82483 were formally identified as those of 17-year-old Linda Pagano. The news broke through the silence of 44 years like a thunderclap that shook the foundations of the local department. For the first time in nearly half a century, Linda finally had her name back and her story was heard. But the identification was only half of the battle because the cause of death was still a grim mystery. Forensic pathologists re-examined the skeletal remains and discovered a small circular hole in the back of the skull. It was the unmistakable mark of a small caliber gunshot wound that had been missed during the initial 1975 autopsy. This discovery transformed a missing person case into a cold-blooded homicide investigation with a clear and violent intent. Linda had not just disappeared or died of exposure, she had been executed and dumped like common trash. The revelation of the gunshot wound changed everything and pointed a finger directly at those closest to her. Investigators began to look into Byron Claflin's history and discovered a pattern of domestic instability and hidden aggression. He had spent his final years in silence, never once mentioning the girl he had supposedly kicked out. The tragedy was that the prime suspect was already dead and could never be brought to face a jury. Mike Pagano received the call from the coroner and broke down in tears of both relief and fresh sorrow. He finally knew where his sister was, but the image of her final moments was almost too much to bear. The community of Reddit sleuths celebrated the identification while simultaneously mourning the violent end of a young life. They had proven that the internet could solve cases that the police had deemed impossible for over 4 decades. But as the sun set over the city of Akron, a new question began to haunt the investigators. Did Byron act alone, Or were there others who helped cover up the murder of the girl with the Mustang? The trail of evidence was old, but the scent of blood was still fresh in the minds of those searching. Every old friend and distant relative was now a potential witness in a play that had no final act. The girl, who was once just a number, was now the center of a storm that refused to calm down. The truth was emerging from the dirt, but it carried a coldness that chilled everyone involved to the bone. Linda was home, but the monster who took her life was still hiding in the whispers of the past. The journey for justice was entering its most difficult chapter as they searched for a motive for the unthinkable. The realization that Linda had been murdered with a gunshot to the head shifted the entire narrative of the investigation. Detectives began to re-examine the original 1974 statements made by Byron Claflin with a much more critical eye. He had told the police that Linda simply walked away into the night after their heated argument over the concert. However, the forensic evidence suggested a much more violent and calculated end for the 17-year-old girl in the park. Investigators wondered how a man could kill his own stepdaughter and then live a normal life for 15 more years. They looked for witnesses who might have seen Byron's car moving in the middle of that stormy and dark night. Old police records showed that Byron had a history of owning several small-caliber firearms, which matched the fatal wound found. This specific detail was never followed up on because the police had initially labeled Linda as a simple runaway child. The shadow of systemic failure grew even darker as the public realized how many chances the authorities had missed. If they had checked the dental records in 1975, the family would not have suffered for 44 years. The online community began to dig into the background of the medical examiner who had performed the first flawed autopsy. They discovered a pattern of rushed procedures and poorly documented cases that had likely hidden many other crimes over time. Meanwhile, Mike Pagano began the heartbreaking task of planning a proper funeral for the sister he had finally found. He wanted to ensure that she was no longer buried in a field of nameless souls under a plastic marker. Donations began to pour in from people all over the country who had been moved by the story on Reddit. They wanted to provide Linda with the beautiful headstone and the dignity that had been stolen from her so long ago. Every dollar was a tribute to a life that had been silenced by a monster and ignored by the very system. As the funeral preparations continued, the police tried to find any living associates of Byron who might know the truth. They interviewed elderly neighbors who remembered the tension in the Claflin household during the early 1970s in the city. One former neighbor recalled seeing Byron cleaning the interior of his car very thoroughly the morning after Linda had vanished. This memory had seemed insignificant at the time, but now it carried the heavy weight of a potential forensic cover-up. The detective in charge of the cold case felt a deep sense of frustration that the primary suspect was dead. There would be no trial, and no chance for a confession to explain the true motive behind the senseless killing. Was it a moment of sudden explosive rage, or was it a calculated act of domestic execution in the dark? The silence of the dead Byron Claflin was a final act of cruelty against the family he had already destroyed. Christina Skates reflected on the power of the number 82483 and how it nearly erased a human. She realized that there are likely thousands of other nameless numbers waiting in cemeteries across the entire United States today. Her work had sparked a new movement of amateur sleuths, dedicated to identifying the forgotten dead using modern DNA tools. The case of Linda Pagano became a beacon of hope for other families who were still searching for their missing loved ones. It proved that no matter how much time has passed, the truth can still be found if someone cares enough. The cold case unit in Akron was forced to apologize for the errors made by their predecessors many decades ago. They acknowledged that the label of runaway had been a death sentence for the investigation and for Linda's memory itself. Every file was being digitized and cross-referenced to ensure that a tragedy like this would never happen to anyone again. The digital age had finally caught up with the physical crimes of the past, and the results were truly staggering. Linda's brother Mike felt a strange mixture of peace and anger as he stood by the newly dug gravesite. He was finally bringing her home, but the cost of the journey had been a lifetime of tears and unanswered questions. The storm of 1974 had finally passed, but the wreckage it left behind would be visible for many years. The next step was to honor her life and tell the world who Linda Pagano really was before the darkness. She was a daughter and a sister and a friend who deserved so much more than a number in a book. The world was finally listening to the girl who had been silenced by a bullet and a misspelled word long ago. The burial of Linda Pagano was no longer a secret affair conducted in a field of nameless and forgotten shadows. Hundreds of strangers who had followed the Reddit investigation traveled across state lines to attend the final memorial service. They stood in a circle of solidarity to witness the moment a human name finally replaced a cold identification number. Mike Pagano spoke with a voice trembling from 4 decades of suppressed grief and the exhaustion of a long search. He told stories of a girl who loved music and the wind in her hair while driving her white Mustang. The image of the car became a symbol of the freedom that was violently stolen from her on that stormy night. As the casket was lowered, the crowd remained silent in a profound tribute to the power of the human spirit. But beneath the ceremony, the police were still grappling with the dark reality of a killer who escaped earthly justice. Every time they looked at the photo of Byron Claflin, they saw a man who had successfully manipulated the law. He had played the role of a grieving father while knowing exactly where the body of his stepdaughter was hidden. Investigators speculated that he might have used the heavy rain to mask the sound of the fatal small-caliber gunshot. The park where she was found was a place he knew well, which suggested a level of chilling premeditated calculation. They wondered if he had ever returned to the site to watch the police fail in their initial superficial search. The thought of him living a full life while Linda lay in a nameless grave was a bitter pill. In the digital world, Christina Skates was now using the momentum of the case to audit other unidentified remains records. She discovered that the typo in Linda's file was not an isolated incident in the archives of the Ohio morgue. Many other families were likely victims of the same bureaucratic negligence that had kept the Pagano family in the dark. The unidentified folder was a graveyard of broken dreams and lost identities that the system had simply chosen to ignore. Christina worked with Carl Koppelman to create a database that would bridge the gap between missing persons and found bodies. Their collaboration proved that technology is only as good as the human heart that drives the search for the truth. Reddit became a global hub for cold case enthusiasts who realized they could accomplish what the authorities often could not. They were the new guardians of the lost, and the voice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. The case of number 82483 was the spark that ignited a revolution in modern forensic genealogy. Every success story since then has carried a piece of Linda's legacy and the lesson of her tragic and long disappearance. Back in Akron, the police department officially retired the file number that had defined Linda for 44 long years. They replaced it with her full name in the permanent records as a final act of institutional and moral restoration. A plaque was placed at the park where she was found to remind the public that life is never truly anonymous. The circular hole in the skull was a silent witness to a crime that time could not erase or hide. Even without a trial, the world had reached a verdict regarding the guilt of the man who died in 1990. Byron Claflin may have escaped a prison cell, but history would forever record him as the architect of a tragedy. The Mustang keys that she left on the table remained with Mike as a reminder of a life interrupted. He often wondered what her life would have been like if she had reached the safety of a friend's house. Would she have traveled the world, or stayed in Ohio, to raise a family of her own in the sun? These were the questions that the bullet had answered with a final and devastating silence in the middle of the night. The final chapter of the investigation was drawing to a close, but the emotional impact was still radiating outward globally. There was one more thing that needed to be done to ensure that Linda's story would never be forgotten again. It involved the very people who had found her in the first place, across the vastness of the digital world. The internet sleuths were preparing a final tribute that would cement her place in the history of solved cold cases. They were about to uncover one last detail that would provide a haunting symmetry to the entire 40-year mystery. The truth was finally home, and the darkness was retreating from the memory of the girl with the bright smile. The final revelation of the investigation came from a weather report dated the night of August 31st, 1974. Forensics confirmed that a massive lightning storm had knocked out the power in the very area where Linda was found. This atmospheric chaos likely provided the perfect cover for the monster to execute his grim task without any prying eyes. The sound of the small-caliber gunshot was drowned out by the rolling thunder that shook the windows of every home. Nature itself had unintentionally conspired with a killer to hide a crime for more than 4 long and silent decades. However, the digital age proved to be a force of nature that no storm or time could ever truly extinguish. Christina Skates and Carl Koppelman were honored by the state of Ohio for their relentless pursuit of a nameless girl. Their work led to a new legislation requiring all unidentified remains to be cross-referenced with modern DNA databases immediately. The Linda Pagano law became a shield for the missing and a warning to those who think they can hide. In the end, the system that failed her was forced to evolve because of the heart of a persistent stranger. Mike Pagano stood at the cemetery one last time, looking at the headstone that now proudly bore his sister's name. The number 82483 was gone, replaced by the words, "Beloved sister, never forgotten, finally home." He felt a gentle breeze and imagined it was Linda finally driving her Mustang into the golden light of the afterlife. The mystery of her death was solved, even if the killer had escaped the cold steel of a pair of handcuffs. Justice in this world is not always a prison sentence, but sometimes it is simply the restoration of a stolen truth. The internet community on Reddit moved on to the next case, but they kept a digital candle burning for Linda. Her story serves as a haunting reminder that every unidentified person is someone's daughter, or someone's son, or someone's friend. We must never allow a human life to be reduced to a misspelled word or a random sequence of cold digits. The darkness of 1974 has finally been defeated by the light of 1,000 screens working together in unison. Linda Pagano is no longer a ghost in the system, but a legend of what happens when we refuse to forget. As the screen fades to black, we are left with the image of a smiling girl with a bright future ahead. She is finally resting in peace, knowing that her name has been spoken aloud by the entire world at last. The case of 82483 is officially closed, but the lessons of Linda Pagano will live on. May we all have the courage to look for the truth in the shadows and the strength to bring it home. This is the end of the long journey for Linda, but the beginning of hope for so many others lost. Good night, Linda, and may you finally find the peace that was so cruelly and violently taken away from you then.